Welcome wherever you're joining from. Let's get going. So a little bit about me. I'm Jonathan. Welcome. I'm co-founder of Precursive, as well as a co-founder of the Services Delivery Alliance, and I host a podcast called The Precursive Perspective on all things services. My background, been in professional services now, in the software business now, providing into professional services, and then prior to Precursive, working in professional services, selling services for as part of 10 years. But my background was selling services into enterprise companies, so background in selling a mixture of subscription, project-based services there. The Services Delivery Alliance is a network of more than 100 companies where services leaders join to discuss strategy and operations and execution topics in a series of virtual and in-person events. And as I said, our podcast is really focused on getting leaders from the world of services in both software, SaaS, and professional services to share their perspective on growing services organizations. What I'm going to cover today in this session is, firstly, what are some of the trends that are driving this initiative? So why are organizations looking to better productize and package their services offerings? I'll then go into some examples of services structures and packaging, as well as profiling a framework that you can use to design and sell these different types of services. What are some lessons learned in combining or blending products and services into a single SKU, as well as some revenue management 101, how not to get screwed by your finance department, that could be translated as. And then am I shoehorning this in at the end to have something about AI? Maybe, but I think there's some interesting use cases here in and around the world of productization and packaging. So let's get going. So first things first, I think in terms of the role of PS, I love this quote from Dave Kellogg. He was previously the CEO of Host Analytics. He's now an EIR at Alderton Capital. I think the world of services has evolved very rapidly over the last 5 to 10 years. I think now in software businesses, services is now in a position where it's moved from being perhaps a necessary evil in some organizations where it's a very technically orientated, we implement software philosophy, to services being much more positioned as a differentiator and as a driver of growth for many organizations. And I think PS plays a critical role in helping customers to realize the value from their investments. I think the one thing that I would add to this is that the role of services is, to do this, you have to accelerate time to value for clients and deliver value to customers on an ongoing basis. And therefore, the services architecture that you have that supports that to provide that ongoing value realization is really important. I think there may have been a perception that at a point in time, services was easy. I don't think it was ever easy, but certainly the world has been changing. I think, the idea that the sands are shifting beneath our feet at the moment for many of us is very true. But certainly, I think for all of us, the change in customer behavior continues to evolve. I think many of us are seeing longer sales cycles, certainly more complex sales cycles with many more stakeholders. You have customers who are looking to reduce cost, and how they lean on your services team to help them achieve that is something that can be an advantage, something that can be potentially exploited, but also can be very challenging with customers looking to cut cost out of their organization. And in some instances, there's still a distrust of software investments or services delivery where there's been perhaps some trauma from failed deployments in the past. When I talk to our customers and people in my network, what I tend to hear is that there's increasing board focus on the world of services. Often that manifests as demands for higher margin. Perhaps the board or the investor is knocking on the door of the leadership community about how can we book more services as ARR, as recurring revenue. But overall, I think any organization now is tasked with doing more with less. So that whether that's headcount reductions, whether that's offshoring, whether that's staff augmentation, which also feeds into the way that PS is evolving. And I do think that it's an exciting place to be now, services, because there's a lot more diversity to services functions, the range of offerings, the range of packages that are out there. And so many services organizations are now thinking about, how do they refine or iterate their go-to-market? And in turn, how do they build ecosystems around their services organization in the form of partnerships to both source and deliver opportunities on behalf of their business? So I think there's a few kind of underlying trends, combined with this rise in subscription services, which I think is something that many on the call will be interested in. I think many companies now provide, a mix of services offerings, right? So on the left-hand side here, we've got more of that traditional PS, right, which comprises more of those static services programs, which is still prevalent in, on-premise. It's prevalent in enterprise software delivery. But increasingly, I think with the explosion of SaaS in the middle column, many organizations now have got this velocity business, or they've got a part of their organization where they're having to deliver products or services much more rapidly than perhaps they have done in the past. And this is defined by a very kind of liquid environment where things are moving around. You've got your team working on multiple engagements at the same time, and potentially these projects are measured in weeks or certainly less than 3 months. And in some organizations, you've got a mix of this in the same business, right? That can be depending on whether you're selling your product into enterprise, mid-market, SMB, or it can simply be through organizations that have grown through acquisition and they've got these different lines of business within their companies. And then on the right-hand side, of course, we've got the rise in subscription services, right? Where companies are trying to take that which has been very ad hoc in the past and package it into a subscription, sell it on an upfront basis to their customers. And again, we can see here that this delivery can be consumption-based, it can be usage-based, it can be very bitty. And so managing these different forms of services delivery in our respective businesses can be very challenging because they can require entirely different organizational designs, capabilities, and also the metrics associated with them can be quite different. I think the final trend for everyone is this path to profitability. This is actually a maturity model that we use here at Precursive for our own services organization. We've increasingly been using this with some of our customers as well. But I think that the commonality for all of the businesses that I talk to is that PS is on a route to profitability, either in the form of if you're loss making, you need to now turn a profit, or if you're making if you're generating margin, you need to do more of that. So I think businesses are really trying to figure out where does the productization of our services offerings fit within a maturity model, fit within the choreography as we try to grow and evolve our services organization. And I think for many, they play a critical role both in services execution and also in the sales of services. So first thing we're going to do, well, we're going to run a poll now, actually. So we're going to run our first poll. So for those of you online, if you can answer the first question, which is how many services offerings do you sell? We can see the results coming through. Thanks, everybody. Brilliant. Okay, so what we can see there, nearly everyone's done. Great. So we've got up to 3 offerings, 20%, 4 to 6, 31%, and 6 plus 48%. So a range of offerings. The numbers there, not unsurprising. I think I'm going to come back to how we manage that portfolio, but that gives you a flavor of in the audience, how many different offerings people are actually bringing to market. So therefore, I kind of wanted to begin here with this packaging section around how do we actually define what these things are? How are they defined? And usually what companies are doing is they're bringing together a blend of different services, right? That can be PS, it can be technical services, it could be CS, it can be support, or whatever the nomenclature is in your organization. But typically when it comes to this productization, what we're looking to do is to turn that into a package. That's step one. Now, from my perspective, and based upon my conversations with folks in the marketplace, that becomes a product when you've been able to sell it as such, deliver it, and indeed potentially renew it. Right? And I think that part is perhaps underappreciated, is like, otherwise these things are basically a bunch of documentation that you have to keep up to date, and maybe there isn't any traction for any of these things. Now, when we turn to like, why are companies doing this? Why are companies looking at productization? Why are they looking at better structuring their offers? I think firstly, customers want it, right? Like, all of our clients are looking to solve their problems as quickly as possible. They have a set of outcomes, they have a set of goals they're trying to achieve. And so being able to structure these offerings into something that is repeatable is going to give you the opportunity to develop more consistently in how you deliver against those outcomes. And ideally, more quickly in terms of faster time to value. Again, going back to the role of services, like the goal of this for all of us should be like, how do we maximize ARR? You know, these propositions can be helping us to drive, for example, for some companies, they're booking ARR when they go live, right? So having a well-structured implementation package that pulls forward that deployment has a direct impact on ARR realization. If we're delivering value quickly to our customers, we can land and expand, we can drive cross-sell and expansion. Again, going back to that board pressure, like if we can generate durable, repeatable revenue in the form of recurring revenues, so what we call SRR, but also, you know, a lot of these offerings can help us to even out some of those revenue ebbs and flows through the year. So arguably it puts you a little bit more in control of your own destiny around revenue. And again, if we're turning some of these things into a subscription, then we're perhaps nullifying some of the issues around, you know, generating a PO for every ad hoc piece of service that we do, or going through the process of having to pull together a scope or simply a transaction. So arguably, by turning some of these things into products, by turning them into a subscription, or simply a reoccurring service, we can maybe reduce some of that procurement friction we see. I think when it comes to productization, I love this quote from Mark, who was formerly running part of managed services at SimCorp. I think it's really important to take an outside-in approach, not an inside-out approach. So don't start with, well, if we're looking to package or productize our services, it's all about how we generate more revenue and more margin. You know, that's going to fall over very quickly. We've got to think about, well, what is inconvenient for our client, irrespective of who does the work, and how do we solve for those things in a scalable and repeatable way? So thinking about across the customer journey, what are the outcomes that our clients need to achieve? What's that operational run state that we want our customers in? And working back from that is something that I think the organizations that have structured this the best have kept that in mind. Let's move forward. So I'm going to now explore some examples of some of these structures and packages. There's a few here. I'm going to go into a few more. I think the way that companies choose to price and structure and measure these things always tends to differ company to company. I've got 3 examples here. So on the left, onboarding services. Some folks call this implementation services. Some call this professional services again, but that is that initial post-sale implementation. And here, again, this can be priced on a fixed price basis. Some companies are doing it on T&M. Some are embedding it in the ARR. Again, the key things in terms of measurement here is how quickly does this happen? So our launch times, the quality thereof, so implementation NPS, and indeed time to value, which again, depending on what you're selling, the way to differentiate between perhaps time to launch and time to value is think of it this way: launch, if you make your customer more secure, for example, more compliant, which can be sometimes a little bit under the surface, or sometimes it's very, very obvious, depending on whether you're selling, like, you know, security solutions, for example, client solutions. But if that initial go live does something that drives immediate value for your customer, then time to launch arguably could be time to value, but there's a lot of debate around that. We've got in the middle success services. So this is where companies are selling or looking to monetize success services, success as a service. Some companies are selling and monetizing their CSM community. Often these can be consumption-based. Again, you can embed it in the ARR. I think the message I'm trying to convey here is that you can price these things in different ways. And ideally, this is impacting your gross retention, your net retention, and expansion, of course, the consumption of your product. And then finally, managed services. And again, you here could have different types of on-demand service, but I've chosen managed services here, where it's typically paid upfront, an annual subscription, but then you can have a lot of variety in how that subscription is structured, which is something I'm going to come back to, because you've got people selling credits, you've got people selling tokens, you've got people selling buckets of hours, right? So there's a multitude of ways that a managed service could be delivered. I think it's very important to think about the naming of these things, because, for example, some companies have found great success of selling managed services into enterprise because they're used to buying it, or they themselves indeed sell a managed service. But for some companies that I've spoken to where they positioned that in SMB, the customer's like, I don't get it, right? So again, those do-it-for-me services, those on-demand services really should be driving recurring revenues and arguably recommendations from customers. By the way, I'll be coming back to questions towards the end. I will hope to get through them all. Cool. Let's progress and look at some other examples of different structures that we see in the market. So again, this is not exhaustive. I think, again, my message would be there are a multitude of ways that you can structure these things, and I've included some examples here. So the all-you-can-eat model, typically that's, as it sounds, it's like a all-you-can-eat buffet, pretty simple to understand, not always simple to execute. So these are usually designed to drive adoption. However, it can get very messy in terms of controlling that consumption. Good, better, best example, right? Which is where you're, building and really gating different features and services between these different offerings, right? So you want to be thinking about how those higher value features should be carefully divided over the different tiers. And additionally, fencing mechanisms that you can use to promote the right usage and therefore migrating people from one to the other. On the right-hand side, build your own. Again, this can be seen in enterprise where you've got, demands from different enterprise customers, potentially lots of customization. I mean, I did see in one company that they had 85 different services SKUs. And I asked the services portfolio manager, well, how many of them do you actually sell? And he was like, oh, less than 20%. And so I think, often what you can find is that the service offering can be developed maybe to sometimes plug a product gap or a value gap. And so they're almost like sticking a plaster or, for our American cousins, a Band-Aid on these issues. And you just end up with a bunch of different SKUs. And then at a certain point in time, you're thinking about, well, how can we rationalize these things? I think one of the things that I would counsel is think about how do these different offerings not just drive additional or unlock additional product revenue with your customers, or indeed retain it, but also act as a mechanism onto other services. Right? So there can be a choreography here where you can say, look, we'll sell potentially some project-based services to begin with, build our credibility with the customer, and then look to move them onto a subscription over time. As a customer, if you've delivered that value and that support to me over a period of time, and it's been consistently good, the idea of folding that into a subscription, potentially less risky from my perspective. So again, I think about that architecture as what is the mechanism or the route to, yes, more value for the customer, ideally more revenue for you, both from a product standpoint and also for your services organization. Okay, now, what I'd like all of you to do on the call, I think there's about 70 people, is think about your own company's customer journey, right? So I would imagine you've got a slide in your business, and again, it goes from left to right, from customer acquisition into onboarding, into expansion and growth and renewal. And there's the different teams that are involved, the moments that matter, maybe the metrics, all of those different types of things. We have that as well in our business. But something that I've been thinking about a lot is that we're all trying to sell typically multi-year agreements, right? Whether it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, for example. And yet, when we think about that customer journey, often it's over a 1-year time horizon. And then when we think about our offerings, again, it's often baked into that first year. And so sometimes I think we try and build too much into too short a period of time. What I'm trying to articulate here is to think about, as we take a step back, let's think about that 3-year time horizon. And so in this example, what I've tried to articulate is, okay, what are the things in the journey that we want to be doing? So there's the acquisition through the renewal, there's optimization, there's enhancements across the top. What are some of the challenges that we encounter with our customers in delivery, in evolving the work with our clients, and indeed in working with them over a longer period of time? And then what are some examples of some of the services props that we sell or services offerings that we sell over that duration? Now, in my business, we sell many of these things. So we sell implementation on a fixed price basis. We also sell an on-demand service in year 1 to our customers that is sold alongside the fixed price service. So we sell a subscription alongside the fixed price implementation. Now, that's been very useful for us because it allows us to, it gives us some almost like a contingency. So if we need to draw on that actually during the implementation, we can do so. It also gives the customer reassurance that we're going to be doing optimization work after the initial delivery. So we don't sell that on every project, but we have been selling that. We also sell managed services. We don't sell value engineering, but I've seen it. The point that I'm trying to make is we've got all of these different propositions, and what companies are trying to think through is there an opportunity to turn all of this into a subscription, which is one of the things that we're going to be aiming to do more of next year at Precursive. And therefore, if all of this is folded into one service where in year 1, we've got a set of outcomes and goals that we're looking to achieve with our customer, year 2, vice versa, same principle, and so on and so forth, then I can begin to think about, over time, what's the skills and expertise that we need across those different stages of the journey. And in turn, what our margin profile might be for those offerings. So again, what we have seen in our research is that many companies might be offering some of those initial year 1 services either at a loss or at a lower margin, but with a goal to move and sort of recoup some of that margin over time. So I think this is a really interesting concept. It's something that we definitely are going to be pursuing, and I've seen others look to pursue. Part of what I'm going to look at is what are some of the risks or the challenges around designing and building some of these subscription services and other services offerings, but also in terms of the control mechanisms to control the engagement and the consumption, which again can be very fluid and put a lot of pressure on your services organization. So with that, before I move on, we're going to do our second poll. Fantastic assistant, which should have come up for all of you now. What proportion of PS revenue is recurring at the moment? Okay. So what is not one-time project services, but is actually a recurring service? Great. Awesome. All right, excellent. Thank you for those that have contributed to that. So you can all see the results, I think. Just a man in the top of my house talking to myself. But so what have we got here? We've got 32% 0, less than 10%. So 66% of you have got less than 10% coming from recurring services, 8% 4 who've responded. So 4 of you, more than 50%. So again, some interesting results. I mean, I think for many, there's a goal to perhaps grow the recurring revenue stream. And again, I'm going to be going through some of the ways that you can do that now. So I've talked a little bit so far about some of the trends, right? Some of the factors driving this productization initiative for many organizations. Covered some examples, some straightforward examples of packages, examples of pricing, examples of KPIs. now going to go through some steps that you can follow, whether you're doing this already and you're iterating, or whether you're beginning to do this for the first time. Hopefully all of you will get some new ideas. This is a simple set of steps that you can follow that typically we see companies going through, and some best, and I'll be going through and double clicking, which is a really tech phrase, or exploring some of these in a little bit more detail. So to begin with, the research that we do, right, to understand what's going on in our market, what are our competitors doing, that customer journey analysis, where are the friction points. I do think competitive analysis is really important. You know, if you've developed a quick start initiative for your 200K ACV product that you sell, right, and it's a 30K quick start and none of your competitors are doing that, then that's either going to be seen as a massive benefit potentially to some customers, or a massive red flag as to why, you know, why is it very different to others. So this perception of how services can be received, you got to be very conscious about what's going on in your market, because it can be a big differentiator, or it can be perceived as like, you know, something is amiss here. So getting it right through the lens of what's going on in your market, what are your customers expecting, super important. From a design standpoint, bringing together the relevant cross-functional teams to align around what you're offering in PS. I mean, I think that's something I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail. What are some of the inputs? How do you map outcomes? You need to build a lot of assets. It's kind of, that's why keeping it simple is really important. But you've got your documentation, you've got your pitch decks, you've got your SOWs, you've got your contracts. Are they lined up? You've got your service catalogs, your digital assets. There's a huge amount of things that need to be produced. From a selling perspective, you know, how do you better align with sales? What are some of the pricing tactics, and how do you incentivize sales? Not just to sell these things, but in general. And then how do you monitor the progress of them and use those KPIs to iterate? So I'm going to drill into now some design best practices. So I think firstly, I talked a little bit about the research that needs to be done. From a customer input standpoint, support tickets, super straightforward, absolute goldmine. I mean, you want to differentiate between stuff that's like a technical gap, a bug, versus how-to questions. Oftentimes, the how-to questions that are coming through the support channel provide opportunities for advisory services, consultancy, for example. Customer success stories, right? But also customer solution success stories, right? We do a very bad job of sharing sort of the 20% that isn't vanilla to what we do, so the config. I think we all could do a much better job of sharing that internally in our organization. I've been trying to get our business into the habit of when we build a solution for a customer and we do that walkthrough, typically we do it live with the client and we do a little recording of getting our services team sharing that with the whole business, so we can see the cool stuff that's being built for our customers where it's being tailored to their needs. So I think those success stories are really important. Have you got a customer advisory board? Get their input. What are the gaps for them? Don't have one? Pick up the phone to 10 customers and start asking questions, right? And look at some of the co-developed offerings as well that you have with your clients. Everyone needs to be around the table, so cross-functional piece. So PS, sales, CS, marketing, finance, don't leave that too late. Again, you know, you can be crushed by finance if you've come up with this subscription offering or fixed price offering or priced it a certain way and you haven't actually consulted with your finance team. Also, you need to understand, regardless of whether you're tenured or whether you're new to role in your department, and if you're a manager or a director, how do you recognize revenue on services? Like, it could be very different to how you think it is being done, or indeed how auditors think it's being done in some cases. And then outcomes mapping, right? So think about the frequency and the impact of the outcomes and the common outcomes that you're looking to achieve, and differentiate between like the outcome and the value. For me, a good framework to use on this is like, the outcome is the change that your customer is looking to achieve: growth, cost cutting, experience improvements, employee experience improvements. The value for me is the monetary or the tangible value associated with that. So how much time was saved, the cost associated with that, the revenue opportunity, etc. So again, in terms of design, really important to keep some of these things in mind. When we're then trying to turn it into a subscription or turn it into something that is recurring, one of the complaints from organization, well, there's a number of issues that you can encounter. So one is like, it's very difficult to manage consumption. So traditionally, what a lot of companies will do is they'll say, look, we'll maybe give you a bucket of hours or an amount of time that you're drawing down on. That could be in the form of credits, tokens, time, whatever it might be. And it becomes difficult to manage that in the timeline that you want versus what the customer wants. It can all bunch up into, if you're not gating it, right, either month over month, quarter over quarter. Some people use a use it or lose it based approach, but again, that control is really difficult. You've got to educate the client on what's being used, right? Resource planning can be very bitty. It can be hours, it can be days, it can be mini projects. You're dealing with tension with the client if there's this use it or lose it. Who owns the customer? Who owns the communications around all of this stuff? So a load of stuff starts to come out of the woodwork when you fold something into a subscription that you want the customer to use, but you want them to use it in an effective way. So a shout out to a member of the Services Delivery Alliance, Andrew Hart, who highlighted like a timeline of engagement that they used in their own organization. They are another software business, data management solution, and they were just talking about the idea of how we can build in some better structure, right, by thinking about, what are some events, workshops, or just structured engagements that we plot out across the year. So in this example, right, at the beginning, we're looking at what are the outcomes that we want to achieve. So what's the strategy? What are the things that we need to achieve? What are the challenges? Can we map that all out? Is it done via heat maps, process maps, whatever it is? But again, conceptually, the idea is we identify the outcomes. You could also then, and by the way, I'm not saying that they need to be in this order. These are merely illustrative, but you could then have health checks, right? Those could be technical in nature, right? Those are performed at a certain point in the year. Do they inform the next quarter? Do they inform the next 6 months, for example? So you've got that technical audit. You then want to think about how you can document the impact, right? And I think a lot of us sort of lean towards case studies. That's sometimes a little bit more difficult to get. I think the impact that you want to be documenting is the impact of your product and your service to the customer that helps them to renew your service or your product, right? So what's more powerful than, a simple internal overview of the impact, the ROI that they can use that makes your stakeholders look good. They can communicate internally, that helps to secure the renewal. And then indeed, how can you think about that future planning, right? What's the roadmap for success ahead? How do we do that strategy review? Underpinning this, you can have your community, you can have the sort of the on-demand or always-on communications, right? That might come through a support channel or a support tool, could be an online portal, whatever it is that you use, could be bots, for example. That can certainly run across this. The idea, though, is by packaging it up and structuring this engagement, you reduce some of that noise that just comes in kind of like, in an uncontrolled and maybe incoherent way. Again, just think about how you can structure this and control the input over the duration. Moving on, so we talked a little bit about design. I'm going to move on and how you can build some of that structure in. Now looking at the sales element. So I think the common challenge for many in working with sales, people often jump to the right-hand side. They often use the phrase, oh, we have a problem with sales enablement, right? But how do we enable the sales team to be better at selling services, partnering with services, pitching services, not zeroing out the services revenue on the sales force, all of these types of things. spelling services in some case. I think the step before that is kind of really the alignment, right? And so I think about it in terms of all levels of the organization, right? So from the leadership community in sales, and actually it goes one step above that, it's really the board, right? What is the board's view of the role of services in your business? Are you an AR enabler, right? Are you a source of revenue and margin? Are you a well-run business within a business, or are you all of the above? So I think getting that alignment, ideally from the board down. Now, if you don't sit on the board, find out who your proxy is on the board. Is it the CCO? Is it the CFO? What rolls up to them where they can have that conversation? You really need to know your sales team's compensation. Right? So what's their comp plan? Are they paid on services? Are they not? Right? But also, when are they paid on deals? Right? So for example, a lot of the time now, they're comped on deals when the customer pays, right? So for one company I was talking to, they've got they sell a deal, they've got a backlog. They're sending out 2 invoices, one for PS, one for licenses. The licenses invoice goes out 3 months after the PS invoice. So again, the narrative with the sales team is not, you've got to be better at positioning services. It's like, how can we partner better together so I can pull forward delivery so you get paid quicker? Oh, okay. Right. Now I'm listening, right? So again, it's really the narrative that you create with that organization from top to bottom, and really fostering that over time. Because as I put in the middle, you're the CMO of services, right? You need to think about how you're marketing services, not just publicly, but internally. And therefore, how you think about that drip campaign of, if you're releasing packages, if you're trying to get them to sell services better, it is like a mini marketing campaign, and you've got to have this communications locked down. You've also got to have the right data. So, so for example, in your pipeline, or on deals in general, do people buy everything up front, or are they staggering licenses? Therefore, the implementation is very important. Therefore, the role of services is very important. Do you have a lot of cross-sell opportunities or expansion opportunities within accounts? E.g., you sell into one team in enterprise and you go from there, right? So my message to my sales colleagues is not, again, you're dumping PS and killing our margin. It's like, how can I drive more expansion, more retention, more growth based upon delivering a great experience? Because that's the message that we need to deliver to our sales colleagues, particularly when it comes to enablement. Then when we get to enablement, unfortunately, there is a bunch of stuff that you have to do, and it is continuous. Enablement is not one and done, roll up at the Q1 kickoff and expect everyone to remember anything after day one, because everyone goes out and gets hammered after day one usually, right? If they're salespeople, it's thinking about how can we have that continuous enablement through the year. Again, coming up with the right ways of positioning services and pitching services, positioning all of these things, having the right pitch decks and all of that type of stuff is really important. On the education side of things, I think ensuring that you use the right types of assets to educate people internally as well as the customer is always advisable from my perspective, when you're not doubling up. I think the key thing, though, to remember about this is the more packages that you develop. So if we go back to that slide where we had the sort of the menu, if you will, all you can eat, etc. The more you build, the more you've got to enable and educate. So in one conversation that I had with a head of services, they'd roll out some good, better, best, 3 options. They were struggling with that. And I said, look, take it down to 2. Give them 2 options. See if that makes it easier. It's door number 1, door number 2. And it actually did. So again, I think less is more. The more that you build, the more that you're going to have to enable and or educate. One final idea, which I love, is if you are struggling to get, like, if salespeople are not incentivized on services at all, or it's a lower amount, and you can do this, what I have seen some companies doing is they run a spiff. So the spiff is, for example, if you pay 3% on services, well, we're going to pay you 5% for this quarter, and PS is going to pay for it. And we're going to eat that cost. And that means that sales commission, for example, is going to move from G&A into a services cost for a period of time. So it's like a internal cross-charging mechanism. So I love that idea that someone had shared with me. Cool. Moving on. We're going to do a third poll. which is all around the alignment with other functions. So it's really asking, we are well aligned with other functions, e.g. sales, CS, product in our design of packages, yes or no? Well, more of us are saying no. So I think there's definitely some work to be done on better engaging with our colleagues. Hopefully, this has given you some tips or some thoughts about who to bring together and how to bring them together. I'm going to move on now to a couple of other items, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to be talking about how we can blend products and services together. What are some of the gotcha moments in that, as well as some revenue management topics and the role of AI. So that's our last little bit here. Right. Okay, so just to orientate you to what we're talking about on this slide. So what some companies are looking to do is sell a mixture of product and service together as a single SKU. So on the left is what we want to sell. Okay, in that scenario, it's a mixture of product and PS. In this example, 200K of product ARR, 100K of PS ARR, 300K of ARR. Now, I've seen this in a number of organizations where they have aspirations to do this, and there's various dynamics that can go on. So, for example, in one organization, they had a situation that is described here where actually the product ARR was discounted a small amount, right? And PS was discounted down to nothing. I saw this on for a company where they were selling a 500K ARR deal, and essentially PS got zero, or the allocation of revenue to PS was zero, which was what was being done behind the curtain. So you have to be really, you have to sort of, if you are looking at this as a business or you're already doing it, you kind of have to very much go in with your eyes open. One comment from a head of PS was like, I started as a project manager and then I graduated as an accountant. Because if you get this wrong, the costs compound, right? Or if you're the victim of this, this is how it's going to hurt you, right? Which is on the right-hand side of things. So in this example, you know, our PS project revenue is 20K, but our costs are 50, right? Therefore, our profit and our margin are not looking too clever. Now, imagine we sell 10 of these and they renew, you're looking at over $1 million loss, right? So pretty significant. And I think there's a few kind of learnings here that the romance and the reality of this are two very different things. So one is, you know, a lot of very interesting things can happen when it comes to revenue recognition. I'm going to talk a little bit more about revenue recognition in a moment. In one example, there was $1 million worth of services sold on a deal. And that was credited to the services team, I think to the tune of about 300K. The rest was to make sales or the product revenue whole again, right? So what actually happened, let's say the deal was $1.5 million, right? $1 million of services, 500K of software, but they had discounted the software significantly. But on the rev rec, they allocated that 70% of that $1 million in PS back to the product line, right? And in this particular example, recognized, because my question was, well, what happens when it renews? Like, how is that working? How is it recognized? And what they were doing was recognizing it over the duration. Now, I would venture that you've got to be really careful in this area as a services leader, because one, if you're not really buttoned up with your finance team and what your auditor's doing and you're working in a public company, be very, very careful. If you're working in a private company and you're doing things to boost ARR overall by blending in products and services, you've got to think about how costs will be recognized, how revenue will be recognized. So, for example, for one company, you know, they were doing this, they were blending it, but the services team was carrying all of the cost and the revenue was being recognized to product revenue. So they were getting none of the PS revenue recognized to their team. Therefore, there's a conversation that they had to have in that situation because that wasn't sustainable for them. So I think, again, just be very careful about the complexity here and some of the pitfalls. Revenue management. So again, on the different offerings that you have, one of the things that I mentioned is like go and talk to finance early, because as you develop these different offerings, you need to understand like what are going to be some of the benefits in terms of ironing out revenue. For example, if you've got premium support or a managed service or a subscription service, you can choose to recognize that revenue flatlined across the year, like 12 to 12. Or in some instances, it's going to be based on consumption, hours consumed, credits consumed. Again, if you're using use it or lose it, great, but be ready if your customer's pissed off because they've lost it, right? And that actually leads to in some cases, some churn conversations. I think that the key message here is this is a constantly moving target, both in terms of the when and how companies adopt accounting standards, and also sometimes how they're interpreted. So a little bit of a minefield. I think the key thing is here that the key message I would convey would be like, you know, the CFO is either your best friend or your worst enemy. And again, given that services as a red line on a P&L can go up or down like a yo-yo, you know, you really want to get aligned around like, what is it that we really want to achieve? And what are the trade-offs from a revenue management standpoint? Because you don't want to be in a situation, for example, where you're consuming all of the cost, but you're getting none of the revenue credit. How long have we got? How am I doing? A few minutes left. All right. So a couple more items. Bandwagon, does AI help? I mean, I think what's been interesting for us, I mean, we've been using ChatGPT, and we've been using some machine learning engines. So our products sit on the Salesforce platform. We use a PSA solution and a project management solution, which is our own internally. And so these are some of the things that we've been building into our product. It's been pretty interesting so far. I think one key area for us has been we've got a very fluid delivery motion, right? Like stuff can move around a lot. It's typically a mixture of kind of like an agile and a waterfall approach. But I think one of the things that we find, particularly for more of the consumption services that we're selling, is it's what I describe as resourcing Tetris. So this stuff is coming in, and how do you allocate it to people more quickly than staring at a resource planner? So Magic Assign has been our way to do that, where it's looking at what is needed in terms of capacity and skills, and it's making the decision on auto assigning that to people. So I think that's an interesting use case. It's also something that I think managed services teams should be exploring in general. The Risk Whisperer is basically how do we move risks from being much more of a much less reactive to being more proactive and looking in the future, and basically saying to the project manager or helping the project manager to be aware of things, and also then in turn how to resolve things based on the data that we have, and also that not all risks are created equal, so how to prioritize things. And then Precursive Predict is when we're trying to structure new packages, it's using ChatGPT to say, build me a service offering for an implementation package where we deliver in X amount of time at Y revenue or margin with this profile of team, and away it goes and does and builds it, which would normally be done in a costing sheet. We'll send out some videos on some of these. I think if you're interested in this, the Services Delivery Alliance is a community that we bring together, as I mentioned. I think there's going to be more and more coming through on this. I think services is an area in general. I think each of these are about elements of automation and intelligence, that in services, when everything is moving around, it's a very, very tough area to work. You know, this can only, in my opinion, provide value in the future. And then wrapping up prior to Q&A, a few things to remember. So one, like if you are productizing or you're packaging or the version of that language that you're using in your organization, it's about repeatability. So therefore, pattern recognition as a habit is really important. And so fostering that in the cadences that you have internally, your internal meetings, the discussion that you have with your leadership community and with the front line is like, what are we seeing that's either a repeatable need or an issue for a customer that we can solve better and cheaper than maybe they can do on their own. Subscription services is a mechanism by which you can reduce reliance on sales, right? Because you become more in control of your own destiny. And also it takes you from being, you know, a fixed revenue source to being a repeatable revenue source, where arguably, you know, when you start calling that out in your P&L, you might be getting 1.5x, 2x value, 3x value on that. Some organizations I've seen are booking their managed services revenue as ARR because it renews, and it's considered durable, repeatable revenue by their investors. So again, those subscription services are an exciting area to pursue. But I think in order to get there, you know, if you're not there yet, as we saw from the poll, you know, think about reoccurrence before you get to recurring. So what are the things that you can reproduce, and do that first before jumping into subscription services? Cool. All right. So we've got some questions coming up here. Let's have a look here. I guess, Robbie, am I just going through these one by one? So, question from James.
Yes, if you start at the top and head your way down.
Great. Sorry if it's covered already. Do we book this revenue as recurring ARR or as one-time traditional PS style? Again, I think if you are selling a services offering as a subscription over a multi-year term, it would be booked as recurring. I think even services products that are products would be one-time revenue in my view, unless it's turned into something that has a renewal to it. It's traditionally the way that I think about that. How does consumption-based pricing differ from usage-based pricing? It depends what you consider consumption as usage in your business. I mean, I've seen consumption in services packages is typically based on the consumption of the service itself and the services team. So it is outside of the product, with usage-based pricing being usage of a product or product features, which unlocks different areas, unlocks different pricing for a product. So for example, if you're on product version A and then you start using these features, you get into a different tier of product spend. Consumption-based pricing is typically, from what I've seen, is orientated around the services package. How do you forecast demand and capacity for on-demand bookings? Well, in our own organization, again, it's somewhat to do with the t-shirt sizing. If it's a package, if it's a bucket of hours for a thing that we know that takes us a half a day or a day spread out over a duration, that can be forecasted in that way. If it is much more bitty than that, like hours coming in here or there, requests, tasks, etc., it's very hard. Typically, what I've seen companies doing, like managed services teams, is they're monitoring capacity at an individual level and then at a team level. And so usually you're allocating, based on estimation, that work into a team for on-demand services based on that overall capacity. And then the team has to have the responsibility of organizing their day to actually deal with those items. It's difficult to do. It's not easy to do. Good call out on, hi Kyle. Good call out on working with finance. Have folks seen a bake-in period before a recurring revenue services program is recognized as recurring by the CFO, essentially having to prove that it will renew on future years? Our CFO, our head of finance, asked me that exact question. He's like, we are booking this stuff now as services recurring revenue. It will be interesting to see if it renews in certain instances. I think we now have in our business, I mean, we're not a huge business, but we've got more than, I think, 300K in recurring services revenue for our business. So again, not a huge amount. But that's grown from probably 100K last year. So I think I've definitely heard people saying, well, you know, it becomes recurring once it's renewed once. It depends, I think, is the answer, Carl. It's like, if they're very keen to begin showing the business that we're doing this, and then I think it's the fortitude of the services leader on backing themselves that this stuff will renew. To me, it comes back to, like, how are you architecting those outer years as I described in the subscription itself? At what point do you consider removing an offering It's obvious to remove is not selling at all. Yeah, agreed. But what if it still sells infrequently? What is the line to determine if the service is worth its overhead to maintain it as an offering? Personally, I would probably do revenue divided by cost, to be honest with you, Jake. So if it's selling infrequently, but it's costing you a bunch of time and effort to deliver, I'd kill it personally. I'd maybe be asking myself, like, why is it? Where does it sell? Could it be iterated to sell more of? Because there's obviously something in it. And then going back to my point about, is it actually worth keeping because it leads on to other things? So maybe we don't sell at that frequency, but it unlocks other things is another consideration. With regards to comp, how do you build a fair and simple incentive and quota scheme when you have PS pre-sales people pitching alongside sales that bring the ops/prospects? So I would assume you're looking maybe for an incentive for the pre-sales folks there. I believe is the scope of the question. I mean, I think that, you know, you should expect what you incent, right? So like there should be some sort of incentive for pre-sales to be positioning services. You've got to get that signed off, obviously, by the finance team. I personally think if they're putting work into generating opportunities, to generating services opportunities, they need to be compensated for it. How you choose to pay for that, Carly, is kind of the interesting point, which I raised around where does that commission or cost sit, or where do you choose to position that? I think personally, you know, you should be thinking about, like, what's the deal value? What's the likely attach rate? What do we want to pay on that? I mean, I think that's the conversation for the finance team. Currently not using the subscription. CS want to keep customer happy and fix everything without charging for it. I want to work with paid work. How do we more align CS and PS? Well, I think it's the alignment of the VP of CS and the VP of PS, or whoever those people are, about with the Crow CEO and CFO about, like, you know, about incentives, about what everyone is on the hook for, but also keeping the customer at the heart of that story, Zane. I think people are often scared of charging for services because if it's being introduced either for the first time, or either if it's introduced for the first time, or if they're not commercially savvy enough to know that people will actually pay for stuff and it's not such a bad thing. I think the examples around where people have been happy to pay for services and the result thereof, right? And also articulating to CS that if this is paid for, we avoid those situations where stuff just runs and runs and runs and runs and runs and no one does anything about it. Because when they're paying for it, they're on the hook for it. They're going to pay more attention to it, and we're going to get it done quicker. And ultimately, what does CS want? You want the renewal, right? So if the customer has to pay a little bit more to get value from a solution, but they're prepared to do it, and we get the renewal, it's a win-win. You know, failing that, you have to get everyone in a room and knock their heads together. Hope that helps. Cool. And with that, we're at time. Thank you everyone for joining. Head over to precursive.com for more content, which you'll find in our resource center. If you want to check out the network that I mentioned, it's the servicesdeliveryalliance.com. Again, you'll find that on my LinkedIn profile. Any questions? Thank you, Christina, and hi, Christina. Thanks, Margaret. I very well spent 60 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. Have a wonderful evening. I'm going to go and have an extremely large glass of wine. See you.